They laughed at the old man in the pool until they learned who he really was. The sun glistened on the surface of a pristine infinity pool, the water inviting, tranquil. It was supposed to be a private escape, a sanctuary. But as Morgan Freeman stepped outside, he froze. Strangers lounged in his chairs, laughed in his water, drank his drinks. They had no idea whose home they had invaded. Does respect come from wealth or character? Comment 1 for character, 0 for wealth. Morgan Freeman believed in privacy. His home wasn't just a mansion, it was his retreat, his safe haven from the world. He had built a life of wisdom, success, and quiet dignity. And today, someone had trampled all over it. As he walked toward his luxurious backyard, something felt off. The gate to his private pool was slightly open. A faint echo of laughter and splashing water drifted through the air. Morgan's brow furrowed. Then he saw it. Sun loungers were displaced. Wet footprints trailed across the deck. Half-empty beer bottles rested carelessly beside his pool. And the worst part? 3 men, complete strangers, were relaxing in his water as if they belonged there. One lay stretched out on a floating lounger, sunglasses perched on his face, sipping from a stolen drink. Another leaned against the pool's edge, kicking at the water like he was in a public resort. The third, standing by Morgan's outdoor fridge, was reaching inside, rummaging for another beer. Morgan took a slow, deliberate breath. Calm, controlled. He stepped forward, his voice smooth but unmistakably firm. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The man by the fridge turned, barely acknowledging him. "Oh," he said with a smirk, "you live here?" They thought he was just another neighbor. They had no idea whose pool they were in. Morgan Freeman had built his life on principles, respect, dignity, and humility. But as he stood on the edge of his own backyard watching 3 strangers lounge in his private pool, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Disbelief. The young man by the outdoor fridge, tall, lean, radiating cocky arrogance, popped the cap off a bottle of beer and took a swig without a second thought. From Morgan's fridge, his friend, still sprawled across Morgan's inflatable pool lounger, yawned, completely unaware of the legend standing just feet away. The third, sitting on the edge of the pool, feet lazily splashing the water, finally turned his head toward Morgan. "Oh," he said with an easy smirk, "you live here?" Morgan remained still, hands in his pockets, his voice as smooth as ever. Yes, I do." The man on the lounger chuckled as if the situation was amusing rather than deeply inappropriate. "Damn, nice place, man. Didn't think anyone was home." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "That's funny," he mused, "because I don't recall sending out any invitations." The third man, the one by the fridge, finally seemed to realize that something was off. He set the beer down, not out of guilt, but out of caution. "Look, no need to get upset," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just a pool, old man. We're not hurting anything." Morgan's fingers curled slightly in his pockets. Just a pool, just a pool. Had the world really become so entitled that trespassing in someone's home was now considered casual fun? He took a slow, deep breath. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice steady. "If I walked into your house, opened your fridge, and made myself comfortable in your living room, would that be just a couch?" Silence. A flicker of discomfort passed over their faces, but only for a moment. Then the man on the lounger shrugged. "Look, dude, it's not that deep," he said, grinning as if this were a joke. "It's hot. The pool was right here and your gate was open. We figured no harm, no foul." Morgan's patience was legendary, but even patience had limits. He exhaled, slowly. "So let me get this straight," he said, nodding slightly. "You saw a private property, assumed no one was home, and decided that meant you had the right to use it?" The young men exchanged glances, their confidence faltering ever so slightly. "I mean, when you put it like that," the man by the fridge started, but Morgan cut him off. "There's no other way to put it." His voice was still calm, but there was an undeniable weight behind it, one that made people listen. And finally, they were listening. Unbeknownst to the trespassers, they weren't the only ones watching. A few of Morgan's neighbors had taken notice of the confrontation. From behind fences through slightly open windows, they observed with curiosity. One of them, a woman in her 50s named Diane, leaned slightly over her deck railing, eyes narrowed. "Those damn kids," she muttered under her breath. She had seen them sneak into yards before. She had heard them laughing about how rich people don't even notice when things go missing. But today, they had picked the wrong house. And the wrong man. Back at the pool, the tension was thickening. Morgan still hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the air feel heavier. But still, these young men were too arrogant, too entitled to fully grasp what was happening. All right, the man on the lounger said, sitting up and stretching. "We'll leave. No need to call the cops or anything." Morgan tilted his head slightly. "Call the cops?" he repeated, as if the idea had never even occurred to him. He let the words settle. Let them feel the weight of their own assumptions. "No," he finally said, "I don't need to call the cops." The trespassers exchanged nervous glances. They had expected anger, shouting, maybe even threats. But this quiet? This was worse. "I don't need to call the cops," Morgan continued, his voice lower now, more deliberate, "because I have something much better in mind." And that was when they realized they had made a mistake far bigger than they could have imagined. The smirks had faded. The careless laughter had died down. The three trespassers, who just moments ago had been lounging in Morgan Freeman's private pool as if they owned it, were now standing near the water's edge, suddenly aware of how wrong everything felt. Morgan had not yelled. He had not called the police. But somehow his presence alone made the air feel heavier. "I don't need to call the cops," he had said, and that, more than anything else, unnerved them. What they hadn't realized until now was that they had an audience. A few neighbors, having noticed the commotion, had started peeking over fences and stepping onto their patios. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Sandra, an older woman from 2 houses down, stood with her arms crossed, her expression unimpressed. "This is what happens when people think they can do whatever they want," she murmured. Diane, from next door, smirked slightly. "They messed with the wrong man," she whispered. Morgan, still standing by the pool, took his time surveying the scene. He wasn't in a rush. He let the silence stretch. Because sometimes silence was more powerful than words. One of the trespassers, the one who had been digging through Morgan's outdoor fridge, shifted uncomfortably. "Look, man," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck, "we didn't mean anything by it. We just—" Morgan held up a hand, cutting him off. "Didn't mean anything by it?" he repeated, his voice smooth, steady. He took a slow step forward. "Tell me," he continued, his gaze locking onto the young man's, "if I walked into your house, drank your drinks, sat on your couch, would you say I didn't mean anything by it?" The young man swallowed hard. "I mean, it's not the same thing." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" Silence. The trespassers looked at each other, suddenly unsure of themselves. For the first time since Morgan had confronted them, they realized they weren't in control anymore. Morgan sighed, stepping closer to the pool's edge. "You see, the problem isn't just that you're here," he said, his tone conversational but laced with quiet authority. "The problem is that you thought you had the right to be here." The one who had been floating on the inflatable pool lounger finally spoke, his voice softer now. "We just thought—" He hesitated, glancing toward his friends. "I mean, it's just a pool, you know?" Morgan chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Just a pool," he echoed, shaking his head. He gestured around him. "This is my home, my space, my peace." His voice dipped lower. "And you violated it without a second thought." The weight of his words settled over them, because that's what it was. Violation, not just of property, but of respect. At that moment, something shifted in the air. The arrogance, the easy confidence the trespassers had walked in with, was gone. And in its place, shame. They weren't just caught. They were being held accountable. Not by law enforcement, but by a man who had built his entire life on dignity, on wisdom, on respect. And now, He was making them face the fact that they had none. Morgan exhaled, watching them carefully. "I could have called the police," he said finally, his voice softer now but still firm. "I could have had you arrested for trespassing." One of them, the one who had first dismissed him as just an old man, tensed. Morgan nodded. "But I'm not going to do that." The relief on their faces was immediate, too immediate. They thought they were getting off easy, until Morgan spoke again. Instead, he said, "I'm going to let you leave. But you need to understand something." His gaze darkened. "This isn't just about my pool." He let the words sink in. "This is about how you move through the world." One of them shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his eyes. "Today it's my home," Morgan continued. "Tomorrow it's someone else's. And one day you'll find yourself on the receiving end of the same kind of disrespect you've shown me today." Silence. The trespassers, now looking far less confident than before, nodded slowly. They understood. And more importantly, they knew there would be no second chance. Morgan took a step back, motioning toward the gate. "Now get out." They didn't hesitate. They scrambled, grabbing their towels, their beer bottles, their arrogance, and fleeing through the open gate. But as they left, Morgan knew this wasn't the end. No, this story was just beginning. Because what had just happened wasn't going to stay in this backyard. And soon the whole neighborhood would know. The trespassers had left, but the echo of their intrusion still lingered. Morgan Freeman stood by the pool, watching the ripples settle as the sun dipped lower in the sky. It should have been a peaceful evening, but now his backyard felt tainted. He had seen many things in his life: arrogance, entitlement, ignorance. But there was something uniquely unsettling about watching people walk into his home, take what they wanted, and then act as if they had done nothing wrong. And what bothered him most? It wasn't just about his pool, it was about a larger issue, one that extended beyond his backyard. The lack of respect. The belief that if something is accessible, it belongs to anyone who wants it. But not today. Not anymore. By the time the sun fully set, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Sandra, the neighbor who had been watching from her deck, had already called her friend Diane. "You won't believe what just happened," she said, her voice low but excited. Diane, who lived 3 houses down, leaned against her kitchen counter. "What?" "Some kids snuck into Morgan Freeman's backyard and used his pool like it was theirs." Diane's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what? Did he call the cops?" Sandra smirked. "Number. He handled it himself." She paused for dramatic effect before adding, "And let me tell you, I've never seen anyone shut down arrogance like that before." Within an hour, the news had spread through the block. By morning, the entire community would be talking about it. The next day, as Morgan was sitting on his patio, his morning coffee in hand, he heard a car pull into his driveway. He turned his head slightly, watching as a middle-aged woman stepped out, her expression a mix of anger and embarrassment. A teenage boy, one of the trespassers from yesterday, trailed behind her, looking at the ground. Morgan sighed, setting his cup down. This was going to be interesting. The woman approached, stopping just short of the patio steps. "Mr. Freeman," she started, her voice tight, "I'm Nancy Calloway. My son Tyler told me about what happened yesterday." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" Tyler shifted uncomfortably, still staring at his shoes. His mother inhaled sharply, clearly holding back frustration. "Look, I understand they shouldn't have been in your pool, but did you really have to scare them like that?" Morgan exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "Scare them," he repeated. Nancy folded her arms. "Yes, Tyler said you made them feel small, that you embarrassed them in front of the whole neighborhood." Morgan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "And tell me," he said, his voice calm but firm, "did he mention breaking into my property, drinking from my fridge, acting as if he owned the place?" Nancy's jaw tightened. "I mean, yes, but did he mention dismissing me, laughing in my face?" Tyler finally looked up, his cheeks burning red. Nancy hesitated. "Well, I'm sure he didn't mean it that way. Morgan let out a slow breath, shaking his head. That's the problem, Nancy. People don't mean to be disrespectful, but they do it anyway. Tyler stayed silent because he knew Morgan was right. Nancy exhaled, glancing at her son before turning back to Morgan. Look, I came here to say I hope you don't hold this against them. They're just kids. Morgan studied her for a long moment. Nancy, he said finally, they're not just kids, they're young men. And young men who don't learn respect now don't magically develop it later. Nancy swallowed. For the first time since arriving, she looked uncertain. Morgan stood up, his presence commanding as he looked down at Tyler. Let me ask you something, he said to the boy. What would you have done if I weren't home? If I had been out of town, would you have kept coming back? Would you have invited more friends? Tyler had no answer, because the truth was, he probably would have. Nancy sighed. Tyler, she muttered, nudging her son, say something. Tyler took a deep breath, finally meeting Morgan's gaze. I'm sorry, sir, he said, his voice quieter than before. Morgan nodded. Good, he said. Now don't let it happen again. Nancy pursed her lips but nodded. Thank you for your time, Mr. Freeman. As they walked back to the car, Tyler stole one last glance at Morgan. Something in his eyes had changed. That evening, as Morgan sat outside, watching the reflection of the moon in his now untouched pool, he felt something shift. Not in the water, not in the air, but in the way people saw him. No one would treat his home as an open invitation again. And more importantly, no one would ever forget the day they learned a lesson from Morgan Freeman. But what happened next? That almost was something no one saw coming. For days, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers about what had happened at Morgan Freeman's house. Everyone knew now his home, his sanctuary, had been disrespected. But more importantly, everyone knew how he had handled it. No shouting, no threats, just wisdom, patience, and a lesson no one would forget. But the real test, it wasn't how the community reacted. It was how the trespassers responded. One afternoon, a week later, as Morgan sat outside reading, he heard footsteps near his gate. He looked up. Tyler, the teenager who had once laughed in his face, dismissed him like just another old man, stood there holding something in his hands. A six-pack of lemonade. Not beer, not arrogance, just a quiet offering. Sir, I wanted to say sorry again, Tyler said, shifting awkwardly. Not because my mom told me to, but because I was wrong. Morgan watched him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, he gestured to the chair across from him. Then sit down, son, he said. Let's talk. Because respect isn't given to those who demand it. It's earned by those who learn it. And sometimes the biggest lessons come from the quietest moments. Through this story, we realize that respect isn't about power, wealth, or status. It's about recognizing the humanity in others. Morgan Freeman didn't need to yell or retaliate. He led with dignity. And in doing so, he changed more than just one moment. He changed a mindset. We live in a world where entitlement often replaces gratitude and where people take without asking. But the true measure of a person isn't in what they own, but in how they treat others. Because character is revealed not in how we act when we're watched, but in what we do when we think no one is looking.